Well, welcome to Run Walk Talk Tales of Inclusion and Development. I'm Judy, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm here with Steph, and her pronouns are she and her. And today, we are each going to share a few podcasts that we're listening to right now and that we'd recommend and that we think would be great to get on your radar. And so I'm really excited for this topic, and I know you are as well, Steph. So why don't you start us off? What is the first podcast that you're listening to right now?
Okay, so I am listening to HBR IdeaCast. So now HBR stands for Harvard Business Review. You may have seen their various sort of articles that they have. And the breadth and depth of the topics, this is why I like IdeaCast, because it goes into leadership. It talks about change management. It talks about equity, diversity, and inclusion. It talks about giving feedback. It also then sometimes plays other podcasts. They'll be like, we're taking a break now, but we're going to refer to the HBR strategy or the, new leader one. And so I really like that, as well as, from a logistics point of view. It's 30 minutes and I can listen to it at a 1.2, 1.3. So it brings it down to like 20. How about you? What's
Well,
your one?
yeah, I totally get what you're saying about the timing of it because I find for a lot of podcasts, because you and I run on the weekends, but during the
Mm-hmm.
week we typically run on our own. And I'll often listen to music, but I also often will love a good podcast. And so that, 30 minutes or less can become quite important if you're going out for a run because I
Yeah.
want to get through the whole podcast, right?
Yeah.
So one of them that fits that bill is my podcast, my first recommendation, Think Fast, Talk Smart. The host is
Mm-hmm.
Matt Abrams. He teaches strategic communications at Stanford, and this podcast covers various aspects of how to communicate effectively in various formats. So he's had episodes about how to communicate clearly in email messages, how to communicate so that you can really connect to the person that you're
Mm-hmm.
speaking with.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a series that's going to be dropping soon about how to lead meaningful meetings. So he's got
Mm-hmm.
great topics, a great roster of guests, and like you were saying about HBR, he does go deep, right? So they're very
Yes.
practical, but I would not call it fluff. He delves into the anxiety that people face around public speaking. And I have to say that I love the title of it because the world is so fast paced, everything's moving so quickly. And it's really acknowledging that, we all need to be able to think on our feet and really deliver messages in a clear and compelling way. And as I said, they're definitely under 30 minutes in length. And if somebody was to get started with this particular podcast, I would say maybe start with episode 120 because he
Mm.
summarizes his top 10 communication takeaways from his 2023 podcast. So, Steph, what's another podcast that you would recommend?
Okay, just before I go into my second one,
Yes.
I think it was Matt Abrams. I'd have to double check who did, because one of my favorite podcasts for the HBR Idea Cast was called Improve Your Impromptu Speaking. Like, so being asked to speak sort of, when you're not preparing a speech, but being when you
Hmm.
sort of asked in a meeting and whatnot. I'll have to
Yep.
double check, but I think it was him who was on that podcast,
Oh,
which
wow.
was
Okay. And
really,
I'll have to check that
yeah,
out. That'll be
yeah,
my action item for the
yeah.
week. I'll check out
We're
that. Yep.
getting, we're doing our action already early on. That's great. That's good. All right. So the second one,
Yeah.
so this podcast is by TED. It is Fixable. So Francis Fry and Anne Morris. They recently wrote, and of course I have to attach it to a book, which I got for Christmas, Move Fast and Fix Things. Again, from a timing perspective, it's a nice package of 30 minutes and they go deep on like solving, I call them, and then sometimes I hear them say like crunchy problems.
Hmm.
And they sort of work through, ask really smart questions, which is why I also like some of these podcasts as you listen to sort of the hosts. They ask really interesting questions to get deep quickly to help solve a problem. So, Fixable by TED, Francis Fry and
Okay.
Anne Morris. They talk about, of course, they talk about topics in their book, but I really, really appreciate their podcast. And I will say sort of the favorite one, and I didn't write down sort of what episode number it was, but it was talking about how to deal with a communication breakdown.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
which is interesting that that was sort of your first podcast, because communication and being able to be an effective communicator is so important. So, what about you? What's
Absolutely.
your number two?
So my number two is The Anxious Achiever. And this is
Mm-hmm.
one with Maura Aarons Mele, and she features topics on mental health in the workplace. And her goal is really to reframe how we think about anxiety and mental health in the workplace. And so she features, high achievers, as she calls
Mm-hmm.
them, who manage mental health challenges. And so people will be on the podcast talking about social anxiety and PTSD and OCD, and she's featured guests with bipolar disorder. So
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
very important for the workplace, bringing mental health and conversations about mental health, out there, making
Yeah.
things transparent and open.
Yeah.
She's had some really interesting episodes that look at micromanagement and its potential ties to
Mm-hmm.
anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
perfectionism in the medical
Mm-hmm.
profession, loneliness in the workplace, menopause in the workplace, how our family, history affects us at work. And more recently, she's had some topics surrounding political events. She's had things about
Mm-hmm.
war and how that impacts us, and about how to manage, the grief from that within the
Mm-hmm.
workplace that either we're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing or our colleagues may be experiencing. So, definitely recommend that podcast.
I'm so glad you brought that one up, because it was on the list, didn't make my top three, but yes, I do listen to that one as well. The Anxious
I was
Achiever, really good.
It was
Yeah.
hard to narrow to three, so I think we're going to have
Yeah.
to do another another episode on podcast. What's your next one, Steph?
Okay, yeah. So then my third one is Maintenance Phase by Aubrey Gordon and Michael Hobbs. And this podcast is all about sort of debunking, as they call it, the junk science behind health fads. And
Mm,
so they as well, I would say Aubrey Gordon has a book, of course. This is her latest book. You Just Need to Lose Weight, another, myths about fat people. And um, I really appreciate their perspective around going deep on sort of the science
hmm
of, these health fads. They get into and they debunk the 10,000 step myth that a lot of us have, like, sort of thought that it's like, oh, we need 10,000 steps, and sort of the science actually behind it, whether you do or not. And it really comes down to sort of the individual person. They also have episodes where they've talked about BMI, which stands for body mass index, and kind of the history of it. So with each episode, they kind of share the history of something, right? Where,
hmm
and why they have an issue with it, or why they don't have an issue with it, or, like, things to take into consideration. And they're sarcastic and humor, and you can sort of see the banter between Michael and Aubrey, which is really great. So I really appreciate Maintenance Phase.
All right. Well, thank you. And,
Yeah.
thinking of humor, my third podcast recommendation, and it's one I'm really enjoying, and it's Code Switch, the
Oh,
NPR podcast, and it
yeah.
looks at and explores issues around race and its impact really on, politics and pop culture and
Mm-hmm.
history. And I mention humor because it does bring humor as it explores these topics. So it's exploring topics in a thoughtful way. A recent episode that I loved really looked at, who has the right to tell stories, and the impact
Mm.
of who is
Mm-hmm.
telling the story on identity. So
Mm.
thinking about issues around cultural appropriation.
Right?
And when we're out running, we will often talk about how, as white women, how do we educate ourselves around issues
Yeah.
on race without putting the onus on people that maybe we're in conversation with for one person to represent the history of
Yeah,
everybody within a race. Similar to, we don't want to represent everybody who's of the gender that we are. Like,
that's right.
it's up
Yeah.
to us to educate ourselves. And so I think that if you're somebody who wants to educate yourself, as we all should be, I would say, check out
Hmm.
Code Switch.
You know what? I feel like that I'm going to give you my action ahead of time because I did listen to a few of Code Switch, but this year my action is going to sort of put it on my favorites and listen to more episodes of Code Switch because yeah, the few that I've listened to are great. And
Amazing.
you, what's your action going to be? Again,
Well,
to
yeah, to be honest, I haven't checked out the podcasts that you've mentioned, so I'm going to check them
mm,
out and
great.
have a listen to them. And in particular, I'm going to see if I can track down that one with Matt Abrams that you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned initially. So I look forward to that.
Great.
Oh, right.
Well,
Well, wonderful. Go ahead, Steph.
thanks everyone. Those are our sort of 3 top podcasts. Until next time. Take care.